I am the Swarm. Author, Quantum Wizard. Chapter 361, Failure. Bad news arrived one after another, leaving Prince Diallo's dark red, magma-like face looking as though it had cooled to a dark green. But reality was indifferent to his growing despair. The second mature space octopus, though damaged, was far less injured than its predecessor. Even after unloading all its passengers, it retained considerable mobility. The destructive potential of a 300-meter mature form in close combat far exceeded that of its smaller counterparts, including the 70 to 80-meter bodies and the larval bodies under 20 meters. Its nearly 200-meter-long tentacles, crackling with blue electric arcs, swept across the ship's surface with devastating efficiency. A single strike could clear away clusters of defensive weapons protruding from the hull without needing to resort to techniques like pulling the radish. This maneuver was instead the Luo-style combat technique, sweeping heaven and earth, a grandiose name for a simple yet effective move. The only requirement? A body large enough and tentacles long enough to execute it. The rampage of the space octopus as it coiled and thrashed about the ship evoked imagery of deep-sea leviathans attacking cruise ships in old movies. Full engines. Get us out of here at maximum speed. Diallo roared. Your Highness, with the repulsion field, main and secondary cannons, laser defense array, and close-in defense systems all active, we don't have enough energy for full engine power, a slit reminded him quietly. Damn it! Diallo cursed, the harshness of his words automatically censored by the translation systems. Deactivate the repulsion field. Shut down the laser defense array. These systems were among the largest energy drains, and the laser defense array had already proven ineffective against the swarm's bioarmor. Disabling it was a logical choice. However, deactivating the repulsion field posed significant risks. In the complex environment of a star system, even traveling at a fraction of light speed was perilous. At 1/20th the speed of light, let alone half that, a single obstacle could lead to catastrophic destruction. But that would still leave us vulnerable, a slit protested cautiously. It doesn't matter. We need to get moving. The reactive armor can handle low-intensity collisions. Once we've gained some distance, we'll have more time to react. At that point, whether we fight or retreat, we'll have the advantage. Now redirect any main cannons without a firing angle to clear the path ahead. With sufficient energy redirected to the engines, they roared to life at full capacity. The propulsion systems emitted increasingly powerful streams of energy. Warships, unlike missiles, required a brief acceleration phase to reach their maximum speeds. At full thrust, the interstellar engines could bring the ship to 1% of the speed of light within moments and, over billions of kilometers, push it past the halfway mark to 50% of light speed. Diallo, however, needed only the initial burst of velocity. Even that brief window of acceleration, taking just 30 seconds, would allow the ship to put tens of thousands of kilometers between itself and its attackers, giving him the breathing room to regain control of the situation. The swarm, well aware of the consequences of letting their prey escape, quickly reacted. If the Daki fleet managed to pull away here, the swarm lacking a speed advantage in the vastness of space would likely lose its chance to destroy them. The prospect of dealing with guerrilla tactics from a dispersed enemy was an infuriating one. Suddenly, the 300-meter mature form froze in place. Its tentacles retracted quickly, pressing against the ship it clung to as its body compacted. Blue electric arcs erupted across its entire form, and the air seemed to grow heavy with the scent of burning ozone. In a flash, the space octopus pushed off the warship with tremendous force, springing forward like a coiled spring released. The recoil was so intense that the stricken warship was jolted out of position. Simultaneously, its plasma propulsion organ fired up, creating a double acceleration effect as it hurtled toward the Doria. The swarm had not missed the earlier transfer of personnel after the flagship's destruction. All the small craft had been relocated to the Doria. Though the swarm's creatures couldn't distinguish between flagships and escorts, they could infer from the ship's size and the activity around it that it was a high-value target. At such a critical moment, where the swarm could only drag one warship into the fray, the Doria naturally became the target. Stop it! Diallo's voice cracked under the strain. The blood vessels in his three eyes swelled to bursting, radiating a mixture of malice, frustration, disbelief, and fear. Realistically, they were already struggling to fend off mature bodies under 100 meters in size at this range, let alone a 300-meter behemoth. In midair, the mature space octopus poised itself, extending two massive, 200-meter-long tentacles crackling with electricity. The limbs slammed down heavily onto the Doria, unleashing a tremendous impact that sent Diallo and the other Daki crew flying. Even the control consoles erupted with sparks from the force of the blow. The recoil, however, wasn't kind to the mature form. Despite the electromagnetic fields protecting its tentacles, the force tore through flesh and muscle, leaving both limbs mangled and temporarily out of commission. But with over a dozen remaining tentacles, losing two hardly mattered. After some recuperation, perhaps basking in sunlight, it could regrow them without issue. This brutal strike was a foundational move in the low-style combat techniques, face-smashing hammer strike, albeit adapted for tentacles instead of claws. The technique's essence remained intact, amplified here by the sheer scale and power of the space octopus. While the move didn't land directly on Diallo's face, its reverberation stunned him as though it had. Shaking his head to clear his thoughts, he opened his mouth to speak, only for the ship to lurch violently again. "Damn it! What now?" Diallo bellowed. Aslet, thrown to the floor by the repeated impacts, hurriedly checked the systems and reported, "Your Highness, it's the third octopus. It destroyed our right main thruster." The Daki, unfamiliar with the swarm's internal nomenclature, referred to these creatures by the Riken name, octopus freaks. "Damn it all!" Diallo cursed again. "Forget them. Just keep moving. Go as far as we can." Despite the relentless assaults, Diallo retained his composure. He knew that lingering here would only invite more of these abominable creatures. The swarm's strategy was blatantly unfair, turning melee-capable tanks into assassins that closed in on fragile targets. The only viable strategy was to retreat, widen the distance, and cut off reinforcements before addressing the situation later. But Diallo's plan was overly optimistic. The Doria was already pinned down by two 300-meter mature bodies, each clinging to opposite sides of the ship. The third mature form had unleashed a torrent of smaller bodies and larvae, while the fourth was almost upon them, and the fifth was already en route. In this scenario, Diallo's confidence seemed misplaced. Other warships might escape, but the Doria was doomed. The two massive mature bodies prioritized destroying the ship's propulsion systems. One by one, they targeted the left main thruster and central main thruster at the stern, inflicting catastrophic damage. Though the ensuing explosions severely wounded the attacking creatures, they succeeded in their mission. The Doria was crippled. The chain reaction from the explosions of the three main thrusters ignited a raging inferno in the ship's rear sections. Although the onboard AI immediately sealed off the affected compartments, the fire continued to spread, damaging critical systems and wreaking havoc on electrical circuits. The Doria's fate was sealed, its complete destruction was only a matter of time. Chapter 362, Turning the Tide. After the two successful Crimson Kiss volleys earlier, if Prince Diallo had immediately pulled back and concentrated fire on the emerging swarm reinforcements behind planet Izumo, using the cleared front as cover, he wouldn't have ended up in his current predicament. But Diallo had placed far too much trust in the intelligence provided by the suzerain, never anticipating that the swarm's energy cannon technology had advanced to such a high level. Being pinned down triggered a cascade of unfavorable events. Yet, perhaps this wasn't entirely his fault. In Diallo's memory, the suzerain had always been infallibly powerful, incapable of making mistakes unless deliberately setting him up. Still, despite being the third prince of the Daki Empire, Diallo had already abandoned the fight for the throne. Out here on the frontier, he was nothing more than a small, insignificant figure in the eyes of the suzerain, hardly worth such elaborate targeting. Could this entire debacle be aimed at the Daki Empire instead? Even so, the loss of these 2,000 warships, while significant, would not cripple their power. Instead of focusing on his escape, Diallo's mind was consumed with these strange thoughts. Subconsciously, he seemed to believe that revealing his identity and intentions would ensure his safety. His sense of crisis was weak, he was more preoccupied with puzzling over the suzerain's motives. Boom! A violent tremor shook the Doria. The fourth mature space octopus had arrived. The already heavily damaged Doria flickered as its interior lights briefly dimmed, plunging the ship into darkness. Before the Daki crew could even scream, the emergency power systems kicked in, restoring the light. However, the situation was dire. The activation of backup energy circuits signaled that the ship's damage was far worse than anticipated. "Your Highness, what should we do?" Aslet asked anxiously, breaking Diallo's reverie. "All warships, deploy every drone. Have the Chisea DX12475, DX12490, and DX12497 move closer." Diallo knew he couldn't sit idly by, he had to make one last effort. Overwhelming the swarm was now impossible. However, even if he were to reveal his identity, doing so freely and proactively would yield a much different outcome than being captured and forced to confess. He had already ordered the retreating warships to return. If he could hold out a bit longer and regroup with the main force, he might regain control of the situation. First, though, the heavily damaged Doria had to be evacuated. Diallo's plan was to use drones to draw the swarm's attention, creating chaos to cover their retreat. To ensure success, he not only summoned the Chisea but also directed 3 other numbered warships to move in. The 4 ships complied, ignoring the rampaging space octopuses still wreaking havoc aboard the Doria, and began encircling it. Boom! Another violent impact shook the Doria as the 5th mature space octopus collided with the ship. Now, a total of 4 300-meter mature bodies surrounded the Doria. Nearly all of the Doria's external structures had been stripped away. Aside from its 200-meter high command tower, the ship was practically reduced to a bare hull. Even the command tower was under siege. 2 of the mature space octopuses had coiled their tentacles around it, their electric arcs crackling as they applied tremendous force. Together, they were executing the low-style combat technique, pulling the radish, attempting to rip the massive tower completely off the ship. But the command tower proved far sturdier than expected. Despite their combined efforts, the tower remained stubbornly attached to the ship. Sparks flew and components burst under pressure, yet the structure refused to yield. The 2 mature space octopuses, frustrated by their failure to tear down the command tower, resorted to wildly swinging their massive 200-meter-long tentacles at it. The barrage of heavy blows caused violent tremors, leaving many of the Daki crew within coughing blood or outright falling unconscious. Fortunately, Prince Diallo had long since vacated the command tower via a high-speed elevator. Under the protection of his escort team, he was now heading toward the landing pad. Deploy drones to clear the small octopuses from the hull. Intercept the 6th octopus missile, he commanded. The smaller mature bodies and larval bodies were far less durable than their larger counterparts, but the drone's smaller caliber weapons also inflicted less damage. Despite this, the sheer number of drones, combined with support from the close-in weapons of nearby warships, gradually wore down the smaller attackers at a slow but steady pace. However, time was of the essence. Several larval bodies had already slipped through breaches at the rear of the Doria, infiltrating its interior and wreaking havoc. In the narrow corridors of the warship, the Daki crew fared little better than the Rikans when faced with these 7 to 8 meter long, ferociously agile soft-bodied creatures. Lacking experience in such situations, they struggled to contain the invaders. Every second of delay increased the threats to Diallo's life. Recognizing the urgency, the Daki resorted to extreme measures. Drone squadrons launched kamikaze attacks. 2 drone formations executed precise aerial maneuvers, performing high-speed rotations to build momentum before hurling themselves into the space octopuses without hesitation. This direct physical impact proved far more effective against the space octopuses than energy weapons. While bioarmor was optimized to resist energy attacks through cellular enhancements, improving physical resistance required thicker armor. The swarm had long prioritized mobility over defense. In interstellar warfare, speed was paramount. Without it, even the strongest defenses rendered a unit little more than a stationary target. Thickening the armor would only make the space octopuses bulkier, increasing energy consumption and production costs, while hindering their agility and development. Thus, physical defense was deprioritized. In this case, the swarm's strategic choice came at a cost. Under the relentless suicide assaults of the drones, the number of space octopuses rapidly dwindled. However, the drones also suffered heavy losses. Even a 10-meter larval body could withstand the impacts of at least 3 drones before losing mobility, while larger mature bodies required even more hits to bring down. Ordinarily, this kind of exchange losing drones for swarm units would still be favorable for the swarm. However, this was no ordinary situation. Here, the swarm found itself at a rare numerical disadvantage. Meanwhile, the 6th 300-meter mature body, on its way to reinforce the attack, was intercepted mid-flight by waves of suicide drones. The kamikaze strikes were far more effective than burst energy projectiles, with the added benefit of near-perfect accuracy. As Prince Diallo monitored the steadily updating battle reports, he exhaled deeply, his tension easing for the first time in hours. Everything seemed to be turning in his favor. Chapter 363, Evacuation? Reality, as ever, was harsh and unsympathetic to Prince Diallo. Your Highness, energy accumulation detected from the direction of planet Izumo. A slit reported urgently, just as Diallo stepped onto the transport vehicle. "What's happening?" Diallo demanded. "It's the swarm's ground-based electromagnetic railguns," Aslit exclaimed. Diallo immediately grasped the situation. Earlier, the concentrated detonation of tactical nuclear warheads hadn't destroyed the swarm's terrestrial weaponry. However, the accompanying light flashes and electromagnetic pulses had temporarily blinded their fire control systems. But the effects of the nuclear blasts were fleeting. After this lengthy delay, the swarm's fire control radars had recalibrated and recovered. The railguns were ready to fire once again. "Order all warships except the Chisea DX-12475, DX-12490, and DX-12497 to turn their bows to face planet Izumo. Activate laser defense arrays and repulsion fields, and form a defensive barrier at the front," Diallo instructed calmly. Given the circumstances, escape was no longer an option. A steady defense, buying time for the fleet's return, was the best course of action. The Daki's execution of orders was impeccable. Since the onset of the battle, even seemingly suicidal commands had been carried out without hesitation. The massive 1,600-meter warships, assisted by their side thrusters, adjusted their positions swiftly. Electromagnetic projectiles, slower than energy beams, gave the Daki ships just enough time to reach their designated defensive positions before the first wave arrived. Turning toward planet Izumo meant these warships temporarily forfeited any chance of retreat. Energy meant for their engines was redirected to power the laser defense arrays and repulsion fields. The repulsion fields proved to be the bane of the electromagnetic projectiles. Although their operation consumed enormous amounts of energy, any ship positioned behind an active repulsion field was virtually invincible. These warships managed to intercept almost every projectile aimed at the Doria and its accompanying vessels. The few projectiles that slipped past the repulsion fields were swiftly neutralized by the laser defense arrays, which were specifically designed for countering electromagnetic projectiles and incoming aircraft. However, defending against thousands of railguns was no small feat. While the repulsion fields held, the warship's other components were less indestructible. After just one railgun volley, two of the defensive warships experienced catastrophic power system failures from the energy overload. Their forward repulsion fields flickered and vanished. Still, the warships had bought precious time. Charging the railguns and the flight time of their projectiles provided a crucial window of opportunity. Several side hatches on the Doria suddenly opened, releasing a swarm of small transport vehicles. They divided into 4 groups and flew toward the surrounding warships. Simultaneously, the Chisea and the other 3 ships opened their own hatches, preparing to receive the evacuees. The swarm, of course, would not sit idly by and watch the Daki evacuate. The few remaining small mature and larval bodies lunged at the transports. But at the same time, the Daki drones launched an all-out frenzy, throwing themselves at the attackers with reckless abandon. One 10-meter larval body had barely leapt into the air before over 10 drones locked onto it, slamming into it mid-flight and reducing it to a pulp. A 30-meter mature space octopus had just latched onto an escape vehicle when over 20 drones slammed into it without hesitation, destroying both the octopus and the Daki transport in a fiery explosion. Seeing their smaller brethren faltering, the 4 300-meter mature bodies abandoned their efforts to dismantle the Daria's command tower. Instead, they turned their attention toward the fleeing escape vehicles. These mature bodies had refrained from attacking the surrounding warships earlier, knowing the Doria housed an important figure among the Daki. However, with Prince Diallo now evacuating, the Doria had lost its strategic value. For the Daki, the Doria without Diallo was equally expendable. As the 300-meter mature bodies began to pivot, the main and secondary cannons of the surrounding 4 warships opened fire. At such close range, even 300-meter mature bodies stood no chance against dozens of main cannons and hundreds of secondary weapons concentrating their fire. The mature bodies were instantly shredded, their bodies riddled with penetrating energy beams. The beams, after tearing through the mature bodies, continued their trajectory and struck the Doria, which was directly behind them. The Doria, along with the small mature bodies and larval bodies clinging to its hull and even the remaining Daki crew still on board, was obliterated in the barrage. The explosion lit up the void, forming a massive fireball. The force of the blast scattered some of the recently deployed escape vehicles, causing chaos. While the Daki lost a single escort ship and several personnel, the destruction of over 90% of the space octopuses significantly reduced the immediate threat. The few remaining smaller individuals were no longer a critical danger. Allowing these creatures to remain unchecked could have resulted in more ships being whittled down over time. In Diallo's view, the sacrifice had been worth it. Your Highness, don't be sad. This was the best solution to minimize our losses, Aslet consoled him, noticing the grim, fluctuating expressions on Diallo's face. Diallo didn't respond. He simply stared into the star-speckled void, lost in thought. Meanwhile, the evacuation was still underway. However, the second wave of electromagnetic railgun salvos was already upon them. With 2 of the defensive warships down, the repulsion field barrier now had critical gaps. More electromagnetic projectiles slipped through the defenses, overwhelming even the laser defense arrays, which couldn't intercept them all due to sheer numbers. A few projectiles struck the ships tasked with retrieving the escape vehicles. Fortunately, their reactive armor absorbed most of the damage, preventing catastrophic destruction. But disaster loomed. Under the concentrated bombardment, several defensive warships experienced power system failures from the strain of overloading. The sudden collapse of repulsion fields left the warships vulnerable, and electromagnetic projectiles slammed into their exposed hulls. Boom! 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 Explosions erupted across the battlefield. Armor plating shattered, and the forward sections of several warships were torn apart. Multiple projectiles tore through dozens of compartments, triggering internal detonations. In mere moments, 2 warships were consumed by flames, while others suffered severe damage. Though their reactive armor managed to shield them from total annihilation, their current state left them defenseless against another volley. To make matters worse, at least 1,000 small mature bodies and larval bodies began swarming in from both flanks. These were passengers that had escaped from the 300-meter mature bodies intercepted earlier by drones. While the larger mature bodies had been stalled, these smaller creatures had slipped free. With the defensive warships severely damaged and the drone reserves nearly exhausted, the Daki could only watch as the swarm advanced. Before they could reach the warships, however, a 300-meter mature body suddenly crashed onto one of the defensive vessels. Chapter 364, Victory. The electromagnetic megastructures had been far from idle during this period. Although the few 300-meter mature bodies they had just launched were intercepted mid-flight by Daki drones, their defensive forces were finally breached, allowing new 300-meter mature bodies to press forward and deploy to designated positions. These large combat units of the swarm barely stabilized their forms before lunging toward the 4 transferring warships. Facing the ferocious space octopuses, the 3-numbered Daki warships began converging on the Chisea to provide desperate cover. Meanwhile, the Chisea ignited its engines and began accelerating. "Your Majesty, what do we do?" a blade asked. Sarah Kerrigan's expression wavered slightly. The 4 warships had recently gathered escape vehicles from the Doria. Any one of them could potentially be the target chosen by the alien Supreme Commander. The swarm's combat units in the area had been nearly annihilated earlier, and the newly arrived forces were too few to intercept all 4 warships simultaneously. A focused effort was required. From the current situation, the Chisea, the largest of the ships, was the most probable target. Moreover, the protective actions of the other 3 warships subtly suggested someone important might indeed be aboard the Chisea. Yet, this very situation made Sarah suspicious. She sensed that such actions might be a ploy, a facade intended to mislead. Raising her head, she put herself in the alien commander's shoes. Earlier, they had transferred from the largest flagship to the second largest escort ship, the Doria, which then became the focal point of the swarm's assault. From this, it seemed likely that the swarm was judging the importance of warships by their size. Thus, after the destruction of both the flagship and the Doria, the Chisea, being the largest remaining vessel, should logically be the most dangerous place on the field. However, the Chisea had also suffered significant damage earlier when it shielded the flagship, with severe damage to its left front hull. Sarah shook her head. If she were the alien commander, she would never choose such an obvious and already damaged warship as her ride. If this line of reasoning held true, the Daki's current actions were likely an attempt to draw the swarm's attention to the Chisea to cover the retreat of the true command ship. Narrowing her eyes, Sarah scanned the battlefield, focusing on the 4 warships. Moments later, she suddenly marked one of them. Found it. Still, with the chaos of battle, illusions and deceptions were rampant. The Chisea's engines had already fired up. Any misjudgment might allow the commander to escape. However, in such time-critical circumstances, hesitation was not the hallmark of an excellent commander. After only a fleeting moment of doubt, Sarah made her decision: full-scale assault. This ordinary warship, while posturing as an escort, had its bow angled slightly outward, standing in a peculiarly isolated position. It appeared to hover near the Chisea, but its location placed it furthest from the swarm's operational units. If the swarm were to focus entirely on the Chisea, its position would block much of their assault trajectory, subtly shielding this smaller warship. The space octopuses that had originally been rushing toward the Chisea suddenly veered, changing their target. And next, the Daki fleet's reaction confirmed Sarah's deduction. Including the Chisea, the remaining 3 warships suddenly accelerated madly, converging in an attempt to intercept the oncoming space octopuses. XXX. What the hell is going on? How did they figure it out? Prince Diallo had completely lost his composure, cursing furiously. He indeed had not transferred to the Chisea, the damage to that escort ship was far worse than it appeared externally. Thus, he had devised a plan. The DX-12497 he occupied had secretly redirected most of its energy reserves to its interstellar engines. The moment the swarm attacked the Chisea, the other 2 ordinary warships would risk everything to block the assault, even if it meant detonating the Chisea. Meanwhile, Diallo intended to use the opportunity to escape this disastrous battlefield. Unfortunately, the plan had been exposed almost as soon as it began. Hold them off. Start the engines. Force an escape. Diallo barked orders as Aslit hastily relayed them. In truth, it would have been more efficient to directly command the shipboard AI at this moment. However, for various reasons, the Daki Empire had always restrained the authority of artificial intelligence. At this moment, a 300-meter mature body led the charge. It leapt onto the DX-12475, quickly scuttling across its hull to the opposite side. Compressing its body, it launched itself like a spring toward the Chisea. Mid-air, its massive tentacles extended toward the Chisea's command tower and coiled around it. Using the inertia, the creature swung a full circle around the command tower before flinging itself at the DX-12497. The sequence of movements was fluid and seamless. In close-quarters combat like this, mechanical warships were simply too cumbersome. Bang! Amidst the hail of bullets and shells, several warships were inadvertently struck by friendly fire, leaving a few scorched craters on the mature body. However, it pressed forward undeterred, crashing into the DX-12497. Seizing the moment when the other warships hesitated to avoid collateral damage, the creature bolted toward the rear of the warship. A single tentacle stabbed directly into the portside main thruster. Boom! A violent explosion ensued. Trading a tentacle for a main thruster? A worthwhile exchange. Diallo steadied himself against the tremors caused by the explosion, his expression dark. Use every means necessary to keep that 300-meter space octopus pinned to the DX-12497's rear. Your Highness! That's too dangerous. Aslit quickly objected. Shut up! Execute the order. Faced with Diallo's menacing glare, Aslit dared not argue further and hastily transmitted the commands. The Daki's execution capabilities were terrifying. Whether it was suicidal defenses or firing on their own commander's vessel, as long as the orders were credible, they were carried out without hesitation. The main and secondary cannons, which had briefly paused, resumed their barrage. The mature body, having just sacrificed its tentacle in the thruster exchange, was caught off guard by the Daki's disregard for their own commander. It was overwhelmed by the relentless firepower and rendered incapable of further combat. At the same time, the DX-12497 suffered severe damage. Of its 1,600-meter-long hull, over 500 meters of the rear section was left in shambles. Having prepared for this contingency, Diallo had secured himself beforehand. Though he was thrown about by the vibrations, he remained uninjured. Under his command, the Daki warships, unconcerned about friendly fire, unleashed a frenzied assault, quickly annihilating the remaining small mature bodies and larval bodies. However, the cost was steep. The DX-12475 was entirely removed from combat. The Chisea, DX-12490, and DX-12497 sustained critical damage. Nearly all these losses stemmed from their mutual friendly fire in their desperate bid to eliminate the swarm's combat units as quickly as possible. Their battered forms were not far from complete destruction. Your Highness, the swarm's electromagnetic cannon has launched, and the next 300-meter space octopus has been deployed. It doesn't matter. This round, we've won. Chapter 365, The End. Neither the defensive warships nor the ships covering the retreat were in any condition to withstand another wave of the swarm's assault. They were battered beyond repair. Yet, Prince Diallo declared victory because the warships that had retreated earlier had now returned. The travel time of electromagnetic projectiles and mature bodies was a crucial factor. Just as they were about to rejoin the battlefield, a barrage of crimson beams appeared from afar, shredding the 300-meter class mature bodies into fragments. A massive fleet of Daki warships abruptly braked near the battlefield. Their activated repulsion fields stopped the electromagnetic projectiles. Any stragglers that bypassed these barriers were obliterated by the laser defense arrays. When over 1,000 Daki warships arrived, it marked the temporary end of this battle. The swarm, faced with such a vast fleet, could no longer mount a pursuit. Similarly, the Daki fleet dared not linger in the area. Thus, the battlefield that had been fiercely contested moments earlier suddenly fell silent. As the Daki fleet turned away, they retrieved survivors from the damaged warships while destroying any vessels too damaged to keep pace. Massive energy streams erupted from their engines, spanning hundreds of meters. Sarah Kerrigan stood silently, watching the receding blue specks of light. Luo Wen's voice sounded beside her. "How do you feel?" "Overlord," Sarah replied, guilt heavy in her tone. "I have let you down." "Oh? What makes you say that?" Luo Wen asked. "The Riken forces were too weak, and it made us arrogant." "It seems you've identified the problem," Luo Wen said. "Yes, Overlord. Without sufficient intelligence, our actions were too naive. We lost over half our forces right at the start. That is indeed your fault. Remember, when facing an unknown enemy, you must remain humble and cautious. Always maintain a reverence for science and the unknown." Sarah nodded, indicating her understanding. The swarm's mode of operation guaranteed that they would face countless enemies in the future. Those enemies would vary in technological levels and tendencies, potentially wielding bizarre weapons capable of countering the swarm. "We'll keep that in mind, Overlord. This battle taught us many lessons. Unfortunately, the Izumo base has been destroyed. It's good that you've learned something and made progress. The price we paid for this education is acceptable." Luo Wen's tone softened as he observed the growth of the blades. It was akin to nurturing a strategy game, watching his subordinates level up a satisfying experience. Though the battle seemed costly, it might not have been a bad thing. A moderately strong enemy awakening the blades to their flaws was far better than an unbeatable foe delivering that realization. "Overlord, it's a pity we let that alien commander escape. If their reinforcements had been 5 minutes later, I would have captured him," Sarah said, frustration evident in her voice. "There are no ifs, Sarah," Luo Wen chided before continuing. "But don't dwell on it too much. Letting him go isn't a big deal. If we encounter him again, a familiar commander is far preferable to a stranger." Sarah nodded. The Overlord was right. This battle had revealed the commander's style. Next time, they would know exactly how to counter him. However, Sarah noticed a contradiction in the Overlord's teachings. Luo Wen had just emphasized humility and caution when facing enemies, yet his recent remarks seemed devoid of such qualities. Surely, the Overlord could not be wrong, it must be her misunderstanding. Thus, she voiced her question. "Sarah," Luo Wen explained patiently, "I said to face unknown enemies with humility and caution. But they are no longer unknown, are they? Besides, their strength doesn't merit the swarm's humility or caution." Sarah nodded as understanding dawned. This time, she grasped his meaning. Be cautious with enemies you don't understand. Once you understand them, continue to be cautious if they are strong. But if they are weak, feel free to flaunt your superiority. At least, that's what she thought he meant, probably. Seeing her nod, Luo Wen smiled approvingly. "Good. You can reflect more later. For now, it's time to deal with our old friends." The stalemate between the swarm and the Riken had been broken due to the sudden interference of a third party. Forced to reveal much of their hidden technology, the swarm inadvertently exposed the Riken to the truth that they had been little more than livestock. As a result, even though the swarm's base on planet Izumo had been ravaged, the Riken acted like obedient children, remaining within their twin-star defensive zone without any intention of exploiting the swarm's weakened state. Hours later, reinforcements from the stellar orbital swarm base began arriving, initiating battlefield cleanup operations. The void of space was filled with the debris of shattered warships. The Daki fleet had lost both its flagship and elite escort ships. While the Daki had activated self-destruct protocols on any ships they couldn't retrieve, the destruction was limited to critical equipment, data storage, and key systems. The bulk of the ship hulls remained intact. Although missing their most valuable components, the wreckage still offered insights. Even stripped to scraps, the swarm never turned down salvageable materials. The arriving primordial bodies dragged large chunks of ship remains into planet Izumos orbit, while mature bodies and larval bodies cleared smaller fragments. The amassed wreckage of over 1,000 Daki warships formed a new satellite around planet Izumo. Swarm brood nest seeds were planted within it, and the satellite gradually turned a mottled purple-gray, wrapped in fleshy tissue that appeared to be digesting and assimilating the wreckage. From within the satellite, tens of thousands of swarm cocoons burst open. Newly emerged intelligent entities quietly began studying the Daki warships under the cover of the fungal carpet. With the battlefield arrangements nearly complete, the swarm turned its attention to the nearby Riken and the spoils temporarily held in their possession. The Riken's response was swift and unequivocal. They submitted a formal surrender. This decision wasn't solely due to witnessing the swarm's true combat prowess but was also heavily influenced by the swarm's covert manipulation. For a civilization whose leadership had been thoroughly infiltrated, capitulation was a foregone conclusion. The prolonged standoff between the swarm and the Riken had largely been Luo Wen's deliberate ploy to see if any third-party forces might reveal themselves. Now that the fish had taken the bait itself was no longer useful. Luo Wen wasted no time in resolving the Riken issue. Years of groundwork sustained tension, psychological pressure, internal protests, media narratives, and even a public referendum had prepared the Riken for this outcome. By the time the surrender was formally announced, the general populace found it surprisingly easy to accept. After all, surrender meant an end to war, along with decades of wartime suffering. Of course, the public's acceptance was also aided by propaganda portraying the swarm as not particularly brutal. Chapter 366, Terms. When the swarm arrived at the Twin Star Defensive Zone, the Rikens, who had never communicated with the swarm before, chose to broadcast indiscriminately to the swarm forces. They used a very euphemistic tone, roughly meaning that for the sake of peace between the two neighbors and to avoid further bloodshed, they were willing to make concessions, and so on a long-winded speech. The central message, however, was "We surrender," delivered in the Riken language. After receiving this message, both sides entered a period of silence. The swarm forces did not attack, nor did they show any other response, leaving the native Rikens feeling extremely uneasy. Several days passed like this. Eventually, the new Riken president, Milton, arrived at the front lines from the home planet and made a more formal broadcast. Thus, in a small, private meeting, the Rikens finally met the legendary swarm people for the first time. "I knew it. Those octopus freaks aren't their true forms. This appearance is much more pleasing to the eye," remarked Alcer, gazing at the female swarm figure engaged in conversation with the president. Her slender physique, armored plates covering vital areas, and spiky joints presented a visage both menacing and beautiful, aligning well with the aesthetics favored by the military's tough personnel. As fleet commanders of the three main Riken fleets, Alcer and his peers held positions of power and real authority, making them naturally eligible to attend the meeting. The camaraderie they had built during their previous joint operations also drew them together now. "Shut it, Alcer. We're the losers here, we need to stay humble," scolded Hamis. "What's there to be afraid of? I didn't say anything bad. Besides, we're so far away that even if I had, she wouldn't hear it," Alcer said dismissively. Yet, just as he finished speaking, the female swarm figure turned her head and gave him a slight smile. Alcer awkwardly raised his glass in acknowledgement. When she turned back again, he exchanged glances with the other two and, in tacit agreement, the trio retreated further into a corner of the room. "Alcer, you really need to curb that habit of yours running your mouth like that," whispered Noval. "How was I supposed to know they could hear that well?" "I'm not so sure she heard it." "What do you mean?" "Nothing concrete, just a feeling. Anyone being stared at by eyes like searchlights would probably sense something." At that, Hamis and Noval gave each other a high five and laughed out loud. Alcer, somewhat flustered and annoyed, chose to deflect. "I think they're being overly cautious. We've been fighting them for so long, what, decades now? And only now do we get to see what they really look like. Other than their appearance, we still know absolutely nothing about them. So, who do you think they're guarding against? It's definitely not us. After witnessing that last battle, it's clear how laughable our strength is now. If the swarm unleashed their full firepower, one charge would wipe us out. I think they may not be guarding against a specific target. They're powerful enough to conceal certain things, which makes them seem mysterious and unpredictable. This strategy probably serves to deter potential enemies more effectively. The group nodded in agreement. That was indeed a logical conclusion. At the very least, the Daki Empire would have to think twice before making any rash moves. But their terms are surprisingly lenient, far beyond what I expected. Exactly. If I were in their place, there's no way I'd be this magnanimous. As the defeated side in a war between civilizations and species, it wouldn't be incomprehensible if the victors chose to exterminate them completely. In their current predicament, where they were like fish on the chopping block, even if the swarm proposed harsh conditions, as long as it wasn't total annihilation, the Reckons were prepared to grit their teeth and agree. They had already steeled themselves for this eventuality. The swarm's conditions stunned the Reckons. First, both sides would maintain their current spheres of influence. The outer edges of the star system would be divided by the Twin Star Defensive Zone, while the inner region would be delineated by Planet 3. The territories within these boundaries would remain under Recon jurisdiction, while territories outside would require further negotiation for passage or development. When this condition was first announced, every Recon present at the meeting was dumbfounded. Before their surrender, the Reckons had held several internal meetings to establish certain so-called bottom lines. For example, regarding borders, they had anticipated that the swarm would confiscate their warships, defenses, and colonies, forcing them to retreat entirely to their home planet. Based on this assumption, they had resolved to fight hard to retain development rights for all the satellites of their home planet. Unexpectedly, the swarm's terms were even more lenient than what they had hoped to negotiate for. It was as if someone intending to haggle for an item priced at 100, hoping to bring it down to 80, was suddenly told by the seller to take it for 20. This psychological gap left the Reckons simultaneously overjoyed and strangely disappointed. The tendency to push boundaries is inherent to all intelligent life forms. A few Reckons, emboldened by the swarm's apparent reasonableness, sought to renegotiate and press for more favorable terms. However, the swarm's representative, a female named Marlene, displayed an imposing demeanor. As a general within the swarm's hierarchy, her identity alone spoke volumes. There was no need for much elaboration. To act as the swarm's representative in negotiations with a civilization underscored her prestigious status. Marlene had previously served under Empress Sarah Kerrigan as one of her more than 10 high-ranking commanders, the only female among them. Attaining such a position as a combat leader required extraordinary effort and demonstrated her unparalleled capabilities. After her death, Marlene had been fortunate enough to be chosen as an intelligent entity, continuing her service within the Blades. When the swarm overlord ordered Sarah to establish a structured civilization, Marlene, being a veteran from that era, was naturally enlisted. Having long held a position of authority, Marlene exuded an undeniable aura. A mere glance filled with murderous intent was enough to silence the dissenting Reckons, leaving them cold and painfully aware of their circumstances. With territorial issues settled, the discussion moved on to the matter of the treasure starship. Faced with the temptation of relics from an advanced civilization, the swarm merely requested the establishment of a research team, leadership of the Reckon research team, and access to prior research findings. The Reckons had originally assumed the swarm would simply seize the starship outright. Instead, the unexpected turn of events left them not only keeping the starship but also gaining the opportunity to participate in its research. Since the results would be shared, relinquishing leadership over the research team seemed like a minor concession. Upon hearing this condition, before others could voice their opinions, the leading Reckon researchers enthusiastically nodded in agreement. Their intense gazes toward their colleagues carried a clear message: anyone who dared to protest would face their wrath. Perhaps it was the researchers' veiled threats, or perhaps it was the lingering chill of Marlene's earlier glare, but the Reckons fell into silence, abandoning any thoughts of further bargaining. Marlene looked at the Reckons before her with satisfaction. She knew that everything happening here was being closely observed by the revered overlord. She could not afford to let him down. Chapter 367, Reception. Once again, to the Reckons' surprise, the swarm had no additional demands beyond the two initial conditions. Measures like disarmament, parliamentary control, or technological restrictions were entirely absent. The Reckons couldn't help but think, if they had known it would be this easy, why did they even bother fighting? They could have shaken hands and called it a day much earlier. Meanwhile, Luo Wen remarked that for production bases, the swarm always offered generous treatment. After a few cycles, the Reckons would inevitably become the second ratfolk civilization. All their middle and upper management would be replaced by intelligent entities, and the average Reckon citizen would only see a harmonious coexistence between the two species. Because the swarm's demands were so incredibly minimal and reasonable, the subsequent meeting essentially turned into a celebration of the beginning of a friendship between the two civilizations. This was also why Hamis and his two companions felt relaxed enough to joke around in a corner. With the heavy burdens lifted from their shoulders, they could finally enjoy themselves. The celebratory meeting lasted several hours. The broad strokes had been decided, and the finer details were left to specialists to handle. Afterward, the Reckons began transferring war prisoners, specifically the Daki people who had fled to the Reckons' twin-star defensive zone, much to the Reckons' chagrin. The Reckons found themselves caught in a dilemma. They couldn't afford to provoke the swarm, but the Daki people weren't exactly easy to deal with either. Both were forces beyond the Reckons' capacity to handle. During the previous battles, even before the fighting had ended, the Reckons had offered the Daki their best hospitality, providing food and drink, despite the environmental differences between the two species, which meant the Daki couldn't consume the offerings. At the very least, the Reckons ensured their efforts looked good on the surface. Even if the Daki eventually won the war, they wouldn't have grounds to criticize the Reckons. This was why Prince Diallo had felt comfortable relocating his crew to Recon territory in the first place. However, since the Daki had ultimately been defeated, it was only natural for these prisoners to be returned to their rightful owner. The Reckons didn't haggle over this issue, it wasn't even considered a condition. In fact, they were eager for the swarm to take away these troublesome lords they couldn't afford to offend or discipline. Of course, during their detention of the Daki, the Reckons had tried probing for information about them. However, the language barrier proved a significant obstacle, as the Reckons didn't understand the Daki language. Fortunately, the Daki themselves were keen to reveal certain information, intending to intimidate the Reckons. Some Daki who were fluent in the Reckon language deliberately and casually disclosed a few details. For instance, they boasted about their civilization's immense power, its dominion over 3 star systems, and its affiliation with a vast confederation containing countless powerful factions of terrifying strength. The Reckons paid little attention to the first part of the message. After all, the swarm surrounded their periphery now, leaving them relatively unconcerned about the Daki. However, the latter revelation about the Daki being part of a massive organization was alarming, prompting the Reckons to adjust their policies. Given the swarm's remarkably lenient terms, the Reckons decided to adopt a diplomatic stance of maintaining independence rather than excessively flattering the swarm. They aimed to prepare for potential crises in the future. In simpler terms, they chose to remain neutral, a fence-sitting strategy to leave themselves a way out. Should the swarm fall to the Confederation in the future, the Reckons could justify their actions and switch allegiances. Nevertheless, when handing over the Daki prisoners, the Reckons shared the intelligence they had gathered with the swarm. They realized that withholding such information would be futile. If the Reckons kept secrets, the Daki might still disclose them to sow discord between the two species. Luo Wen was fully aware of the Reckons' petty schemes but said nothing. When it came to production bases, he had always been magnanimous. As for the Daki prisoners, Luo Wen had already planned their fate. A satellite of planet Izumo had been hollowed out, with numerous rooms carved inside. The Daki prisoners were promptly relocated to this satellite. The Daki people had complex feelings toward the swarm. On the one hand, they harbored a sense of superiority, looking down on what they saw as rural primitives. On the other hand, there was the shame of having been utterly crushed by those same primitives, as well as a deep sense of shock and confusion over the swarm's combat prowess. Outwardly, however, they showed a far more subdued attitude. The arrogance they had displayed while in Recon territory was significantly reined in. A few Daki individuals shouted loudly in Recon using the same rhetoric they had used on the Reckons, hoping to intimidate the swarm. They didn't know the swarm's language, so they could only use Recon. However, they were aware that the swarm could understand them. Yet, no intelligent entities from the swarm responded. Only small space octopuses and several unfamiliar multi-legged bugs escorted them deeper into underground passages. The surrounding tunnels were lined with purple-gray fleshy tissue. As the group moved forward, Daki individuals at the back of the line began to disappear one by one. Fear started to spread among them, and the tunnels filled with angry curses and vile language in Daki. But these outbursts, regardless of whether they were understood, did nothing to disturb the bugs. The swarm maintained an unshakable calm. Their serenity stemmed from their single-minded obedience to Luo Wen. To the swarm, nothing else mattered. Overlord, the Daki themselves might not be of much concern, but how should we handle the forces backing them? Sarah Kerrigan asked. Luo Wen shook his head. It's too early to make any judgments. We need more intelligence. For now, let's see what information these captives can provide. But who knows how long that might take. This is an entirely new species, Sarah said with some concern. Given our prior experience with the Reikans, it shouldn't take too long. At most, 2 years, and we'll have it under control. Luo Wen spoke with confidence. In matters like these, his input carried the most weight, as the experiments and operations required his personal involvement. Furthermore, as an immortal species, his perception of time had changed. 2 years, to him, was merely a short period. Will that be enough time? Couldn't the Confederation attack us in the interim? Sarah pressed. Don't worry. That escapee is far from resigned and is still looking for an opportunity to turn the tables. As long as he hasn't lost all hope, he won't seek external help. Indeed, after his retreat, Prince Diallo, staring at his remaining fleet of over 1,000 warships, believed he still had a chance. He was already plotting a decisive counterattack against the swarm. What he didn't realize, however, was that his every move was being monitored by the swarm. During their advance into the Reikan star system, the swarm had deployed countless observer bugs. Some disguised themselves as meteoroids, while others embedded themselves directly into asteroids. A fleet of over 1,000 warships presented too large a target to lose track of. While their ships were coated with stealth materials designed to evade radio detection radar, those measures were ineffective against the swarm's advanced optical technologies. I'm just worried those monitors might trigger alarms, Sarah admitted, her concern still lingering. Luo Wen fell silent, recognizing the validity of her concern. This was indeed a significant issue. The surveillance devices discovered near the battlefield were clearly not of Daki origin, introducing a major variable into the equation. Chapter 368, Supplies. Time flows on, never stopping. For the Reikan people, the conditions were relatively lenient and simple after their surrender. Without the need for constant militarization, the lives of ordinary citizens actually improved significantly. With the gradual increase in the proportion of intelligent entities controlling public opinion, any minor resistance groups or insurgent forces were quickly eradicated. As a result, the Reikan people would not be consuming much of the swarm's energy for the foreseeable future. This gave Luo Wen the time to carefully ponder how to deal with the behemoth backing the Daki people. Prince Diallo, after reorganizing his fleet, had been waiting for an opportunity to strike a significant blow against the swarm. However, he was unlucky enough to be dealing with the swarm. The swarm was unlike any civilization he had encountered before. Compared to other civilizations, the swarm's approach could only be described as excessively passive. Take the Reikan people, for instance. Currently, the Twin Star Defensive Zone encompassed the Reikan home world, planet Cloud Return, and 2 other planets. Other than the home world, the colonies on the other planets, limited by their size and population, could not sustain fully developed industries. Thus, there was frequent movement of transport ships between these planets to exchange resources and supplies. Many of these transport ships operated without the protection of warships, making them excellent targets for ambushes. However, the planets governed by the Reikans were relatively close to one another and equipped with extensive defensive facilities and patrolling warships. Any ordinary space pirate who ventured in would likely find it impossible to leave. Prince Diallo's fleet certainly had the capability to penetrate these defenses, but the Reikans were not his ultimate target. In fact, he had covertly communicated with the Reikans, who used the swarm as their shield. Their message was clear: if he could take down the swarm, the Reikans would unquestionably pledge allegiance to him. The Reikans painted a picture that was as appealing as possible. Although something felt off to Diallo, he couldn't quite pinpoint the problem. Meanwhile, the distances between the swarm's bases were far greater. The planet Izumo base and the stellar orbital swarm base were separated by the entire Reikan territory. Similarly, the distance between the planet Izumo base and the planet Ray's base spanned hundreds of millions of kilometers. With such vast distances, any routine communication or transport activity between the swarm's bases would have allowed Diallo to demonstrate the Daki Empire's harassment tactics. Unfortunately, the swarm's bases truly did not require any routine communication. The swarm's bioweapons had the unique ability to grow stronger just by resting. They often drifted lifelessly in space, completely ignoring the Daki fleet even if it passed nearby. This left Prince Diallo extremely frustrated. Deploying small units to provoke and lure the swarm proved futile, as the swarm simply didn't engage. On the other hand, launching a full-scale assault against a swarm base was something he dared not attempt. Even the weakest swarm base, located on planet Rays, could easily render his fleet a one-way trip. The awkward situation didn't end there. The swarm was naturally indifferent to the passage of time, every day that passed only meant further growth. Diallo, however, did not have that luxury. While the flexibility of his mission allowed for delays of several years, there was one major constraint: the dwindling supplies. Energy and fuel were less of an issue, as the fleet had departed well stocked, sufficient for several decades of travel and even a couple of high-intensity battles. The real problem lay in the lack of food. Water, at least, was manageable. Each warship was equipped with a recycling system capable of purifying wastewater and other byproducts to potable standards. With a bit of mental fortitude and a blind eye, it was just about tolerable. Food, however, was another matter entirely. It wasn't as if they could process their waste into something fit for the dining table. Although every warship was equipped with an ecological cabin, a warship was, after all, a warship, not a specialized supply vessel. The ecological cabins were modest in scale, typically enough to meet the needs of high-ranking officers, but with very little surplus, making it impossible to supply the entire Daki crew. Prince Diallo's original plan was to conquer the swarm and the Reckons, taking over the Recon homeworld. While the Recon homeworld differed slightly from the Daki homeworld in various parameters, it was still a habitable planet. Slightly modifying the land would have allowed for the production of food consumable by the Daki people. At worst, the Recon food supplies could have been adapted for their use. With this resource secured, they could have stayed indefinitely. This was why Diallo had only brought 2 supply ships on this expedition. But with the unfavorable progress of the war, compounded by the constant state of readiness for potential battles, the crew remained fully active, consuming resources at an alarming rate. Although Diallo had established clandestine ties with the Reckons and managed to smuggle some food from them, the Reckons, wary of overstepping, eventually stopped cooperating after a generous donation of supplies. The lack of a shared currency further hampered transactions. Frustrated, Diallo's temper flared to the point where the cracks on his molten visage deepened, swearing to make the Reckons suffer in the future. However, such impotent rage did nothing to resolve the current crisis. Moreover, the food smuggled from the Reckons required extensive reprocessing to remove toxins harmful to the Daki people before it could be consumed. This process was exceedingly tedious, and the Daki warships lacked the equipment for large-scale processing. Even if the Reckons had provided unlimited food, Diallo's fleet would still have struggled to escape the specter of starvation. Despite these challenges, Diallo stubbornly continued to roam within the Recon star system, searching for opportunities. Unfortunately, their reconnaissance only revealed encrypted communications between the swarm's bases suggesting potential secure transmissions. Beyond that, the swarm's bases exhibited no interaction. Even the intercepted communications, encoded with baffling complexity, yielded no decipherable information despite numerous attempts. Amid this stalemate, a sudden opportunity emerged. As previously mentioned, Diallo had brought 2 supply ships on this expedition, the largest models in the Daki fleet. Each was equipped with massive ecological cabins capable of supporting the daily needs of personnel from 200 warships. However, due to their massive size, each measuring 3,000 meters in length, even larger than Diallo's flagship, their movement was exceedingly slow, rendering them unsuitable for military operations. If these ships appeared on the battlefield, they would merely serve as easy targets. Thus, during wartime, supply ships were typically hidden in secure locations within friendly territory, where they could safely provide logistical support to the front lines. Diallo had hidden his 2 supply ships in a debris field on the outskirts of the Recon star system. Over this period, the supply ships had produced a significant stockpile of materials, awaiting the fleet to retrieve them. With careful rationing, these resources could sustain Diallo's fleet for another year or 2 of operations. However, Diallo was acutely aware that, although the swarm seemed indifferent, they were undoubtedly monitoring the fleet's movements through various means. A large-scale fleet movement toward the supply ships would likely alert the swarm, placing the slow-moving supply ships in considerable danger. Therefore, unless they reached the point of absolute desperation, Diallo would not risk retrieving the supplies. Nevertheless, the presence of the 2 supply ships brimming with resources gave him a much-needed boost of confidence. Chapter 369, Communications. A behemoth with a length of 3,000 meters might not stand out within an asteroid belt, but the swarm's observer bugs were everywhere. The Blades had already discovered the Daki ships hidden within the asteroid belt. Through various analyses, they speculated about its general purpose. Besides the 2 supply ships, the Daki Empire had another vessel concealed here. This vessel, though not particularly peculiar in appearance, measured nearly 2,000 meters in length and looked unremarkable. To anyone unfamiliar with the Daki fleet, it would simply be mistaken for a warship. However, its presence alongside the two supply ships hinted at something different. At first, the Blades assumed it was a warship protecting the supply ships. Later, they considered that, for breaking apart asteroids, the supply ship's own cannons would suffice. And in the event of an attack, having one more or less warship wouldn't make much difference. Furthermore, this act of concealment added an extra target and increased the risk of exposure, so the likelihood of it being a warship was slim. Additionally, the ship, at 2,000 meters long, only had 4 main cannons, fewer than the main cannons on a 1,500 meter class warship. Due to the limited information available, the Blades could only surmise that it was a functional ship, though its exact purpose remained unknown. To avoid alerting the enemy, the swarm employed the ancient orbital sling. The swarm had developed considerable expertise in low-velocity launches, demonstrating remarkable accuracy. Even at low speeds, these projectiles matched the velocity of the primordial bodies flying with their plasma propulsion organs. The advantage of this purely physical launching method was that it generated almost no energy fluctuations. Combined with the stealth system of the primordial bodies, at this stage, they were challenging to detect by any means other than gravitational wave radar. Thus, while using a planet to block the Daki fleet's line of sight, several orbital slings were secretly grown on the fungal carpet on the far side of planet rays. A few primordial bodies set off silently. After months of travel, while Prince Diallo was still leisurely touring the Gaia, he suddenly received news that their supply ships had been attacked. T/N, no clue what Gaia is. Hopefully the author explains what it is soon. XXX. How did they find us? Prince Diallo cursed. The swarm had numerous units, and after the Riken people surrendered, the Riken star system had essentially become the swarm's stronghold. The Daki Empire lacked any noteworthy stealth technology. A 3,000 meter long behemoth being discovered wasn't unexpected. What truly puzzled Diallo was how the swarm had evaded his surveillance. At this stage of interstellar warfare, when opposing forces engaged, they would detect each other from hundreds of millions of kilometers away and then spend 10 days or so flying at full speed to reach firing range. As a result, ambushes were virtually non-existent. But the message he received described the swarm's space octopuses suddenly appearing and attacking the supply ships. He knew the swarm's space octopuses could achieve optical invisibility, but even while cloaked, their plasma propulsion would still produce energy fluctuations. At the technological level of the Daki civilization, such energy fluctuations were difficult to hide within a star system. Damn it! Diallo cursed again, unwilling to accept the situation. Aslet, standing nearby, pondered for a moment before saying, "Your Highness, do you remember the information provided by the suzerain mentioning that the swarm possesses a very traditional launching tool that generates no energy fluctuations?" "You mean?" "Exactly. I suspect the swarm used that launching tool to send their space octopuses to the supply ships. While the swarm has ignored our fleet, they've been relentlessly targeting our surveillance equipment, sparing no expense. This behavior seemed suspicious before, but at the time, we couldn't figure out their intentions. Now it's clear." Prince Diallo nodded, accepting this explanation. It made sense now, but understanding it after the fact was of no use. Time couldn't be reversed. Although the supply ships immediately sent him an alert after the attack, by the time he received it, half an hour had already passed. Diallo was well aware of the space octopus's close combat capabilities. The supply ships, with their poor combat capabilities, didn't stand a chance once the creatures got close. Half an hour was more than enough time for the space octopuses to crush and dismantle them several times over. The two supply ships were one thing, but the real issue was the communications vessel, which was exceedingly valuable. The Daki Empire's home world was over 10 light-years away from the Riken star system. Using conventional communication methods, a single exchange of messages would take more than 20 years. Additionally, transmitting signals over such long distances made concealment difficult and consumed vast amounts of energy. However, the communications vessel was equipped with a highly advanced quantum communication system. This system could facilitate nearly instantaneous communication across 10 light-years. Its unique transmission mechanism provided exceptional stealth and encryption. While it consumed more energy than conventional communication methods for short-range use, the energy expenditure didn't significantly increase over long distances. Beyond a certain range, conventional communication became more energy-intensive, and over interstellar distances, the difference grew exponentially. This quantum communication system consisted of a transmission unit and a reception unit, both highly sophisticated. Some critical components were still beyond the Daki Empire's technological capability, forcing them to rely on imports. As a result, these systems were extraordinarily expensive, given their inability to be domestically manufactured. Diallo had been permitted to bring such a system only because of a mission assigned by the suzerain, as well as the vast distance involved. It was meant to facilitate real-time communication with the home system. Frankly speaking, the functional ship itself wasn't particularly valuable, but the quantum communication system aboard it was worth far more than many of Diallo's siblings combined. This was also why the communications ship hadn't used the system to contact Diallo. It was useless since none of the warships on Diallo's side were equipped with quantum signal receivers. Still, even timely notification would have been futile. Diallo's fleet, even at maximum speed, would take hours to reach the site. By then, the space octopuses would have already crushed and dismantled the communications ship and perhaps built a tower with the wreckage. Your Highness, what do we do now? Aslit asked, having reached the same conclusion. To prevent critical technology from being compromised, vital vessels were equipped with self-destruct systems. If the situation escalated to a certain point and the Daki captain failed to initiate the self-destruct, the onboard artificial intelligence would activate it autonomously. This was one of the rare high-level permissions granted to AI by the Daki Empire. Unless the AI was remotely disabled and the captain was cowardly enough to avoid triggering self-destruct, the communication equipment was as good as gone. However, based on the swarm's past actions and behavior, they didn't appear to possess the ability to remotely disable artificial intelligence. Still, whether the equipment was destroyed or captured by the swarm, it was no longer in the hands of the Daki Empire. The loss of such high-value equipment was a massive headache, even for a crown prince like Diallo. Chapter 370, Information. What is the swarm's apparent style? The swarm's infiltration technology is towering, eerily silent, and leaves no trace. Thus, most external civilizations perceive the swarm as relying on brute force and sheer numbers. This perception is not entirely inaccurate. With the swarm network functioning as a cheat code, the swarm has not placed much emphasis on conventional network technologies. In a battle between two civilizations dominated by mechanical technology, information warfare, cyber attacks, and electronic interference usually begin long before entering artillery range. However, swarm warfare skips these steps entirely. In the end, it always comes down to relying on their unparalleled regenerative and production capabilities to grind their enemies to exhaustion. While this approach leverages the strengths of biotechnology to the fullest, it undeniably has its shortcomings. For example, Luo Wen was now at a loss, staring at the two self-destructed supply ships and the strange functional vessel before him. After fighting for so long, all they had gained was a heap of scrap metal. In the past, this would not have seemed problematic because there had been no treasures worth coveting. Take the Rikans, for instance. Their research units had been infiltrated so thoroughly that their technological tree was essentially open to the swarm. Even the head of their science department, Cleo, was a member of the swarm, so there was no need to reverse engineer anything from captured warships. But now, with the Daki Empire and potentially many other future adversaries, the swarm lacked the time to prepare such thorough groundwork. Hence, gathering intelligence and technology from captured ships during the early stages of conflict had become an essential means of understanding enemies and refining their capabilities. In this situation, watching treasures repeatedly being reduced to scrap metal was maddening. The two supply ships were still acceptable losses, containing, at most, some unique ecological recycling technologies. Luo Wen himself was an expert in this field. But the peculiar functional vessel clearly valuable was lost before they could even discern its purpose. This loss brought Luo Wen a fleeting yet real pang of regret, despite him being a digital being without a physical need for breathing. The sensation, nonetheless, felt authentic. Fortunately, the swarm overlord had noticed this issue. What the overlord valued, the swarm valued. Luo Wen believed this area of research would see increased investment in the future. Meanwhile, on the Daki side, Prince Diallo found himself in a dire predicament after losing both the supply ships and the communications vessel. Cut off from his home world and with supplies running critically low, he had no choice but to reveal their identity to the swarm. At a distance of 500,000 kilometers from the swarm's Izumo base, the Daki fleet broadcast a signal. The swarm easily intercepted and extracted the information. A prince of the Daki Empire? The Interstellar Technological Confederation. Luo Wen furrowed his brow as he read the intercepted data. According to the information, the opposing civilization, the Daki Empire, governed 3 star systems, with its borders located approximately 13.2 light-years from the Reincarnated system. These details aligned with intelligence previously gleaned from prisoners of war, leaving little doubt about their authenticity. However, information that the war prisoners had previously been vague about was now detailed in this broadcast. First, the Daki Empire belonged to an organization known as the Interstellar Technological Confederation, boasting over 200 member civilizations. Some of these civilizations commanded territories spanning over 100 star systems. The broadcast then transitioned into an extended eulogy of the organization, praising its possession of countless advanced technological theories, an invincible joint fleet, the unity and camaraderie of its members, and their mutual support and fiercely protective nature. At the end of the broadcast, it was mentioned that if the swarm was willing to pay a certain price, the organization could conditionally allow the swarm to join and provide them with protection. Naturally, this would also require the swarm to show its gratitude to the Daki Empire, who acted as their guide and introducer, including gestures of tribute and compensation for the losses the Daki Empire incurred in this war. The words were filled with an implicit, almost tangible threat, making the message clear: the swarm had best comply obediently and avoid any foolish resistance. Otherwise, the powerful joint fleet of the organization could invade the swarm's territory at any moment. "What should we do, Overlord?" Sarah frowned and asked. "Don't panic." Luo Wen chuckled. The information in the broadcast was riddled with inconsistencies, making its credibility questionable. Firstly, the existence of the organization itself was likely true, as were the vast territories of powerful civilizations and advanced technologies. These were things that, if real, would inevitably be verified in time, so there was no need to fabricate them. However, the subsequent claims became dubious. For instance, notions of unity, camaraderie, and mutual support. Luo Wen didn't believe a single punctuation mark of it. Not to mention, if the swarm were beaten to a pulp and then forced to join such an alliance, Luo Wen's unforgiving nature would guarantee that he'd find an opportunity for revenge. As for the tributes and reparations mentioned at the end, it was outright nonsense. If Luo Wen had a better understanding of the Interstellar Technological Confederation, he wouldn't tolerate a mere crown prince of the Daki Empire daring to threaten the swarm in such a manner. He'd have already mobilized the swarm's forces to confront the Daki leadership directly. Under the Overlord's will, the swarm did not respond to the broadcast. However, the normally idle primordial bodies began to stir. They started forming groups, swaggering from the Izumo base to the stellar orbital swarm base to absorb solar energy, then returning after a few days to draw planetary radiation. Since Diallo's message had been sent as an indiscriminate broadcast, the Reincarnated near the swarm base also received it. "Everyone, you've seen the message. Please feel free to share your thoughts," President Milton said, looking rather troubled. Because of the precedent set by his predecessor, Antonio, measures had been taken to prevent excessive centralization of the president's power when Milton took office. As a result, his authority had been significantly curtailed, leaving him unable to speak decisively and forcing him to convene meetings to hear the opinions of various leaders. "With the swarm outside as a shield, the Daki Empire is hardly a concern," said one Reincarnated Council member. "Moreover, the credibility of the broadcast remains questionable, but I believe there truly is a powerful force backing the Daki Empire. This aligns with our previous speculation regarding the treasure starship. When the Daki fleet first appeared, the Reincarnated had noticed that, while formidable, the fleet did not seem advanced enough to have created the treasure starship. However, we still don't know what this powerful force intends. If all of this is simply the Daki Empire acting on its own initiative, then it's easy enough to deal with. But if this is orchestrated by the force behind them, we must consider the possibility of them intervening directly." "Exactly. While the swarm is indeed formidable, I estimate they may not be a match for this hidden power. If a conflict truly breaks out, we, caught in the middle, should prepare in advance.